And you're with World News Today from BBC World. I'm George Alagaya. Now, most of us may think the Cold War has been over for several years, but in Switzerland, famous for its politics of neutrality, some vestiges of it remain. The country still maintains a policy of providing nuclear bunkers for all its citizens. There are over 250,000 of them, and every year the warning sirens are tested. But questions are now being asked about whether this costly policy is really worth keeping.
Switzerland's Sonnenberg road tunnel may look ordinary, but look again. It's also the biggest nuclear shelter in the world, with space for 20,000 people. A World War II concept the Swiss say they've improved on.
People in London were searching shelter in the tunnels of the subway, and there was no organization behind. Now, we have not a big, but we have a small organization to help those people.
In fact, the organization is obsessive. The Sonnenberg was designed to withstand a 1 megaton blast. That's 70 Hiroshimas. Everything a society would need is down here, even a prison. Right across Switzerland, it's the same. Everyone's got a shelter, so where's mine? With the neighbours, it turns out.
So this is where I would go with my family, should the unthinkable happen. As you can see, there's a big blast door here, reassuringly thick. We'd step over into the shelter here. It's pretty small. We'd be sharing it with the neighbours, 10 of us in here. And over here, the air filter, still working, even in 2007. But this family, like many Swiss families nowadays, have started to use their shelter for something rather different.
Shelters seemed such a good idea in the Cold War, but now...
We did ask ourselves this question as well. But we then said we have these shelters for nearly the whole population, and we do not know how threats do develop in the next 5, 10, 15 years, so our decision was to keep them.
And they're still being built, even though many Swiss think it's all a waste of time, money and blast-resistant concrete.
We've got to stop this nonsense. It's adding 3 or 4% to house prices, and it's not protecting us against anything. These things are just very expensive wine cellars.
And already Sonnenberg's elaborate preparations are being dismantled. Not because they've been deemed unnecessary. The real reason, when tested, the 350-ton blast doors, which were supposed to seal the tunnel, wouldn't actually shut. Imogen Folks, BBC News, Bern.
Well, I'm joined in the studio by Andrew Smith of Subterranea Britannica, which researches civil defence bunkers here in Britain. Andrew, while that was going on, you had a little chuckle to yourself, and it may be fun to poke fun at the Swiss, but are they alone in having these bunkers?
Absolutely not. There's a number of countries who've done them over the years. The Swedes certainly used to build bunkers underneath their homes. There's a number of examples of public shelters in Finland, particularly Helsinki. Beijing has extensive tunnels underneath it, but perhaps the best example of them all is Moscow and Berlin, where their underground stations, they're equivalent to the tube systems. A number of the stations were actually converted with huge blast doors to be civil defence bunkers for the public in the event of nuclear attack.
What I find difficult to understand is what's the logic behind them? Because frankly, who'd want to kind of wake up after a nuclear war and come out into a world, populated by cockroaches and rats?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want a place in the bunker, that's for sure. It is coming down a bit to bunker mentality and why you actually build this sort of facility. But I suppose at the time, during the height of the Cold War, everybody was terrified the Russians were coming. Whether they were or not is another matter, but these things are now, for the most part, obsolete.
That's the interesting thing, isn't it? You mentioned the Cold War, but we haven't got a Cold War. Does the fact that the threat has changed mean we need to find new solutions or new ways of protecting ourselves?
Absolutely, without doubt the threat has changed. The Russians are no longer coming through the Berlin Wall. The threat today is very much terrorism, and a new command and control structure and response to this type of threat is needed. There's been some examples in England of this. Recently we've had the fire service have created 7 devolved regional control centres. Even the Metropolitan Police are in the process of creating 4 devolved centres. But perhaps the best example of them all, if we look across the Atlantic to New York, where New York City have opened their Office of Emergency Management, the original one having been destroyed in the terrorist attacks on September the 11th, 2001. And that's a very big 65,000 square foot facility.
Now, and that's interesting, and you say the command and control is important, but and you also say the threat has changed. But what about the dirty bomb? I mean, aren't we being told that actually at some point a terrorist might get hold of effectively a nuclear bomb? You'd want a bunker then, wouldn't you?
No, I wouldn't. I have no desire whatsoever to sit. Whilst I may spend a lot of time researching these things, I have no desire whatsoever to hole up in a bunker for 28 days whilst the radiation dissipates, because I'll be sat in there with my food and my water whilst the surface fried, and of course I've got all the food and water, the people on the surface haven't, so they're going to want to try and get into my bunker and get my food and water. So it's a very tough decision to make as to whether you're going to defend.
But in some senses we'll need protecting from that. I mean, command and control isn't going to protect us from dirty bomb.
No, really, and you can have a bunker, and the bunkers wouldn't have protected us on back in July last year when we had the attacks on the London tube system. Terrorists have the element of surprise. They've got to be lucky every time, whereas ourselves, I've only got to be lucky once, rather, whereas ourselves have got to be lucky every single time in stopping these attacks.
Andrew Smith, we've got to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all from World News Today. Nigeria's Vice President, Atiku Abubakar, has strongly denied the corruption allegations which are threatening to derail his bid for the presidency in April's elections. He admitted that his government had failed to deal with the grievances of the people living in the oil-rich Niger Delta region, where there's been a spate of kidnappings of foreign workers. That's all from World News Today. From me, George Alagaya, goodbye and stay well.